Son of God.
Right.
And so later on in time,
Yes.
they had to create the Nicene Creed to make people know he's not the Son of God, he's actually God. So like, explain that to me, if you like the whole thing. It was really
Great question. Serious question, thoughtfully put forward. Thank you, sir. You're right. There was confusion and debate among people who call themselves Christians in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, in the 21st century. You will get
with a God who's going to send me to hell just because I don't believe in him. That's kind of a dick thing to do.
I agree with you. I don't want to be with a God who's going to send me to hell just because I don't believe in him. But no one's going to hell simply because they don't believe. Human beings are going to hell because they choose to live their life separate from God. And because God respects their free will, he's not going to drag them into heaven to spend eternity with him against their will. You see, it's a deeper issue than simply playing a little intellectual gymnastics. If I choose to live my life separate from God, God respects my free will. He respects my decision, and I will spend eternity separate from him. That's the only reason people go to hell, not because they got intellectually confused. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but the thing is like, obviously nobody wants to spend eternity in hell. Even if you die and you realize, like, oh, like, crap, this is real.
Right.
Like, nobody wants to spend eternity in hell, so he's not going to be like, oh, I understand, you don't like me, so I'll take you to hell, don't worry. He'd be like, oh, well, you know, you were wrong, you understand that you want to spend eternity with me, so that's fine.
If you want to spend eternity with God in heaven, you'll put your faith in Christ, and you'll spend eternity with him in heaven. He offers you that gift right today. So it's your decision. But if you choose to live your life separate from him, he respects you. He gave you a rational mind. He gave you free will. And if that's the decision you make, he will honor your decision. Guess what, sir? You don't have to study for your next exam. You can party, party, party. But you will flunk. And if you flunk enough of your exams, you will be expelled from Texas State University. Does that mean that Texas State is a warped, evil institution? No. It means you and I have to grow up, and we have to realize, although we're free to party, 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 we're not free to escape the consequences. We will flunk, flunk, flunk. See, so part of growing up, part of maturing means I realize I can get drunk every night, but my brain will fall apart. I will become an alcoholic. I can get high, get behind the wheel of a car, but there's a good probability that I'm going to end up dead from a car accident. Now, I'm free to do that, but I'm not free to escape the consequences of my decisions. Go out and get a job. Show up late to work. You do that enough times, you will be fired. Not because your employer is evil and warped, but because there are consequences to your decisions. Have unprotected sex. You will probably get STD. Well, guess what, guys? That's called facing reality. That's what you got to do. Does that make sense? Now, what do you think about Christ?
Well, everything that you just mentioned, like all those examples,
Yes.
say, you know, there's, you will get an STD because that's true. That is the thing. Like, that will happen. You will get fired because that's true. You will flunk your test because that's true. Nobody knows if God is real or whatever. It's not a fact. It's not true. None of it, you should understand at least, like, oh, you know what? You're on Earth and there's a lot of crap going on down there that there's no scientific evidence for this or that or this or that. You have free will. Like, I understand it's weird. It's hard to, put your entire life into something that you're not even sure is real. Why should I put my entire life on believing in something that I don't even know if it's real or not? And if it turns out not to be real, then I've been living my life the way that I don't want to.
Okay, great question, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness. You're articulate, you're thinking well. Thank you, sir. You show respect, and I appreciate that, so thank you. All right. Sir, if anybody says to you, unless you can scientifically prove it, it's not true, please look them in the face and say, no problem. Just please scientifically prove to me that unless I can scientifically prove something, it's not true. You see, sir, it's a lie. It's a total lie if anybody says, unless you can scientifically prove something, it's not true. Why? Because that's a philosophy. The statement, unless you can scientifically prove something it's not true, is not science. It's a philosophy. It's a philosophy that says all of knowledge is contained in science. Sir, you don't scientifically prove that George Washington was the first president of the United States. You historically gather eyewitness testimony that points to George Washington being the first president of the United States. Science is a wonderful branch of knowledge, but it's just a small branch. There's historical knowledge, there is personal knowledge. To put it most bluntly to you, sir, don't go on a scientific date.
I don't disagree with you.
Don't do it.
I don't disagree with you. I think that what you said about science is true. The thing is I personally think that there is something that's greater than us that we can't explain. I mean, we can't explain space, for instance. Like, there is no way to explain the infinite, it's just, we can't comprehend infinity in general.
Right.
So there are things that we can't explain, and I agree with you. But the thing is, I think there's something, bigger than us out there. But why are we supposed to believe in one exact, this happened, this is Christ, this religion, when there's hundreds and hundreds of other religions that, how do we know that the Muslims are right? Or how do we know that, this person's right and this person's right? It just seems ridiculous to focus your whole life on one thing that we don't even know is true.
Great issue. First point, the reason that I trust Jesus is because the historical, not the scientific, the historical evidence of the way he lived his life, the content of his ethical teaching, the way he died, loving and forgiving his enemies, and most importantly, fourthly, the way he rose from the dead, points to him being reliable. Those 4 points. First of all, the way he lived. Second of all, the content of his teaching. Thirdly, the way he died, loving and forgiving his enemies, not hating them the way I would have. And fourthly, the way he rose from the dead. That historical evidence points us to the fact we can trust the dude. He's not a con artist. He's not a charlatan. He's not out to rip us off. Jesus Christ is reliable based on his lifestyle, his teachings, his death on a cross, forgiving his enemies, and his resurrection from the dead. Now, take any other option. Take Buddha, Muhammad, the avatars of Hinduism. Take science, rationalism. Take hedonism. Just live to stimulate your nerve endings. Compare it to Christ, and I think what you'll find is the evidence is Jesus is more reliable than any of the options.
So, say I'm a Buddhist or something, all right?
You bet.
And I unknowingly follow everything that Jesus has told his followers to follow. I follow all the 10 Commandments, I don't put all my faith in Christ per se, but I'm generally a good person. I do everything that he tells us to do and he tells us not to do. I don't do this.
Okay.
Am I still going to help us?
Okay, great question. Sir, I've been speaking on university campuses now for 30 plus years, before you were born. I have never met one person who can honestly say, I have never sinned. Pardon me, there was one student at MIT up in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Real smart.
In a lounge, this MIT student said, I've never sinned. All of his classmates burst into laughter. You see, sir, we all know, because we have consciences. Every atheist has a conscience, every agnostic has a conscience, every Buddhist, Christian, Hindu has a conscience. We all know that we have fallen short of moral goodness, pure moral goodness. I certainly have. No, I've never brought a whip down in the back of a black slave, but I've had racist attitudes. No, I've never raped a woman, not even date rape, but I have lusted. No, I've never stolen money out of a bank, but I have been greedy. I'm not this great person I wish you all would believe that I am. I am a dirty, rotten sinner. That is why I need the grace of God, the forgiveness of God. Well, is God interested in forgiving me? Yes, Jesus Christ said. And the way that God forgives us is through Christ's death on a cross.
We're trying to get through here.
All right, could you all move in a little closer?
Thank you.
You bet. No problem. Have a great day. Thank you. All right. So, Christ claimed that he bled and died on the cross to pay the penalty for my sin. Now, here's my problem with that. My problem with that is, I don't want you to know, and I don't want to acknowledge that I got a problem with evil. Murderers, rapists, they got a problem with evil. The KKK, they got a problem with evil. But not me. I'm a great guy. Sir, I'm lying to you. Although at times I do good, this way I'm sure you do good at times, I at times do what I know is wrong. And I experience guilt. Well, guilt, according to Christ, is God's alarm system. Wake up and smell the coffee, Cliff. You've blown it. And Christ offers me God's grace, His forgiveness. Now let me give you a quick story to illustrate this. Italian truck driver loves to visit brothels. So do his fellow friends who are Italian truck drivers. One day an Italian truck driver says to this guy, "Hey bud, there's a really, really good prostitute. And she lives in this brothel." And this first Italian truck driver says, "Well, wait a second, that brothel's pretty close to my home. But I'm going to go there one day anyway, secretively." So he goes to that brothel. He asks for this woman that his buddy, the truck driver, tells him is a really good prostitute. He asks for her, and he waits in the room for her to come. The door opens, and in walks his wife. Now, he almost kills her physically. He has to be restrained. But notice what's happening. Notice the duplicity. Notice the self-deception of the truck driver. He has no problem with going around to brothels. But when his wife plays the prostitute, he's irate. You talk about double standards. You talk about a stinking hypocrite. And yet, guess what, guys? We all do that, don't we? It's really easy for me to point to ISIS. It's really easy for me to point to the KKK. It's really easy for me to point to certain people and say, "Oh man, they got a stinking problem with evil." But guess what, guys? So do I. I've been hypocritical. I need God's grace. I need Jesus Christ. Does that make any sense?
Why should any of us believe your God versus Islamic God or Hindu gods or Egyptian gods, any other gods?
Great question. Why should a person believe in Jesus Christ and not in Allah, the avatars of Hinduism? Because you hopefully, due to your intellectual honesty, have read the Quran and you've examined what is the evidence that Muhammad spoke the truth. What's the evidence pointing to him being reliable? Hopefully you've read the Gospels and you've asked yourself, what is the evidence that Jesus Christ is reliable, that he spoke the truth? And hopefully you've read the Vedas and Upanishads and you've asked yourself the question, what's the evidence that the avatars of Hinduism are reliable?
As compared to what? History? Your own personal feelings about it? Or how do you compare it to reality or truth?
Good. The way that I determine whether something is true is two ways. First of all, I use my rational mind to examine trustworthiness. And secondly, I look at my experience of life and ask myself, does what this is teaching square with my experience of reality?
Have you ever seen a talking donkey or a talking snake?
No, I have never seen a talking donkey or a talking snake.
So why do you consider the Bible reliable when they both reference both of those talking creatures?
You bet. Because I realize that because there's a supernatural God, miracles are not irrational.
You've already presupposed the God. You've already gone beyond the Bible. So why do you presuppose a God before you read the Bible that supposedly confirms the God that you're presupposing?
I do not presuppose God. If the question is, why, Cliff, do you believe that God exists? Which is not what you asked initially, but you asked it now, and I appreciate it. I will tell you, the reason that I believe God exists is not because any book tells me that God exists. The reason I believe God exists is, first of all, order and design point to an intelligent designer. A shirt points to a tailor. A car points to a mechanic. A basketball team points to an intelligent player and coach who've put together rules to play a game, and they play it well. A piece of art points to an artist. If I prepare a delicious meal, put it before this man, and then say, there is no cook, that is stupidity. A delicious meal points to a chef. You never once get order and design by accident. So, the reason that I believe God exists is because when I study the human eye, the amazing intricate design and order, when I study the laws of nature, the amazing order, I have to conclude there's some type of intelligent mind, some type of God. You don't get that kind of order by chance.
Really? Have you ever seen layers of rocks?
Yeah.
Was that put there on purpose, or was that by natural method?
By a process.
Right. Does that require an intelligence behind that process, or is that just a process that happens yearly, periodically?
Well, sir, I can promise you, I never get something from nothing.
But you
So you're not going to have a rock coming about out of nothing by chance. The existence of a rock, the existence of the earth, points me to a cause, points me to some type of rational being who created it. Now, a process of erosion is a fascinating process that we study in science, and that is good.
Can you create a rock out of nothing?
No, it is impossible for something to come from nothing.
Yet you claim that your God did that. So how do you do that?
No. What I'm standing here saying is God is an eternal being who never had a beginning. All right? And so, before the universe existed, there was God. And God, this personal being, created the universe, including rocks. Pardon?
Did he create it out of nothing? Or did he create it out of parts of himself? Yeah.
Created it with his energy. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God used his energy, his explosive creativity, and he created something where previously there was nothing.
So where did his energy come from?
His being, he is an eternal being, without beginning, without end. His energy came from his being. That's who he is.
That's specifically a Christian ideology, but
It's Judeo-Christian
and Muslim, and Muslim too.
and Muslim.
But you're still saying that if you make an exception for this, your hypothesis that a God existed
Right?
in perpetuity,
Right?
why couldn't the universe in some fashion or other exist in the same eternal sense?
You bet. Because of the Big Bang Theory.
And that only talks about our universe, not before the universe or what preceded or what coincided.
But at this point, the overwhelming evidence is there are no oscillating universes. Before the Big Bang, there was nothing. Then the Big Bang occurred, which means the universe is not eternal.
That's not the Big Bang Theory. Big
Yes,
Bang,
it is.
No, it is not. You
Sure
can
it
talk to a physicist. The Big Bang Theory happens a moment after the beginning because that's all that our science can go back to is basically the Planck time after the initial spark, if you want to call it that. The Big Bang only talks about 10 to the minus 44 seconds onward. The Big Bang and before is purely speculation. That's not part of the Big Bang Theory. That's like when you're saying that evolution says that life comes from non-life. Again, the beginning of life is not part of evolution. That's abiogenesis, which is just speculative hypothesis at this point.
Arno Penzias got a Nobel Prize because he discovered the Big Bang. I can promise you it's real clear that before the Big Bang, there was essentially nothing. Arno Penzias in the 60s got a Nobel Prize for it. Now, you can conjecture about what was around before the Big Bang, but there's no evidence that there was anything before the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the beginning of the universe. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause.
Radioactive decay has a cause?
Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. It's that simple.
Have you ever seen something begin?
Yes, I've seen something begin.
Like what?
Like the beginning of knitting together a shirt.
But that came from fabric. That's just the assembly of fabric. You're talking about an entirely different concept. You're talking about something coming from nothing becoming something. That is not taking something and refashioning it into something else.
right.
All of our experiences are just remanufacturing the molecules that are here, or energy, not coming from nothing. So how can you extend this concept of nothing comes, you can't get something from nothing and bring it back?
It's impossible to get something from nothing. There has to be an intelligent being. Muhammad never lived. Muhammad was a myth. I'm going to look them in the face and say, you are wrong. The historical evidence is that Muhammad lived from about 570 to 632 AD, and there's a ton of historical evidence that he was a real space-time person. Anybody who says Muhammad never lived is smoking something I don't want to smoke. Okay? Similarly, anybody who says Jesus Christ never lived, they are wrong. The historical evidence is Jesus Christ lived. Anybody who says Siddhartha Gautama Buddha never lived is wrong. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha is a real space-time human being.
So are you basing it off of you being a space-time being for it to be truthful?
No. No. What I'm saying is, when you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you are confronted by a historical claim that God has stepped into space and time, into human history, in the person of Jesus Christ. That's a claim. Now, what you and I have to figure out is that a bogus claim, or is there evidence to support that claim?
Has there been other claims made?
All right?
Is that for us to have historical evidence, are you saying it has to be the time-space being for it to be true? Like, what
Good.
exactly makes it historical evidence
You bet.
then? If,
Good. I cannot say that Hinduism is wrong because it's mythology. Why? Because you can communicate truth through mythology. All right? So you see, the claim of Hinduism is not, this is an historical event that points to God loving you. Instead, Hinduism is a mythology that's claiming to communicate truth. The same thing with Greek mythology. Greek mythology is not claiming Zeus was a real space-time person who walked the earth. No. It's claiming that Zeus is a god going around in a chariot throwing lightning bolts, okay? So it's not an historical claim. So for me to say Greek religion is wrong because it's mythology is dishonest.
can you define historical claim then?
You bet. Historical claim is, I saw this happen, I heard this person say this, I was in an archaeologically verifiable place, not in a trance, I wasn't dreaming, I was cognizant of you being here today, Thursday, October 27th, 2016. I was standing here in front of the Stallions at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas, and so were you, and we had this conversation. That is eyewitness reportage, as opposed to once upon a time in the land of Nod, Winkin, Blinkin, and Odd took a boat ride.
Like Genesis.
That's not Genesis. Genesis is not once upon a time. Genesis uses poetry, which means you better not take out your stopwatch when you read Genesis, because Genesis 1 and 2 is poetry. Now, starting in Genesis 3, we have historical narrative. But Genesis 1 and 2 are not stopwatch history. Right?
And also you said one of the points where it has to be the person in the right mind.
Yeah.
Okay. So a person has to be in the right mind before it can be historical evidence?
Well, a person has to be reliable.
Reliable. Even though they can't be out of the right mind, even though they're reliable.
Well, if a person is out of their right mind, I don't think they're going to be able to write in a coherent, intelligible manner. I work with mentally ill patients. They cannot write literature that flows and is reasonable. It's disjointed. Okay, yes ma'am, go ahead.
Why is it that in Christianity, we're asked to believe all these fantastic stories
Right?
that were, again, plagiarized from more ancient texts, but yet we're told that because they're not Christian based, that they're not as equally real or could have happened. It's a disjointedness of the whole thing that I don't understand.
All right.
Because all of those fantastic stories that we find in the Bible and that we are told are for real and should believe
Yeah.
happened many centuries before that and were transposed into the Bible. But yet we're not supposed to believe those fantastic stories that happened before Jesus came. Why is that?
All right, ma'am, I've answered you twice before this question. This will be the third time, okay?
Not really.
Yes, I have. I have studied Osiris. I have studied Isis. I have studied Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology. I can promise you the Gospels are radically different. Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology is exactly that. It's mythology. The Gospels are an historical record of an historical person named Jesus of Nazareth, who lived a sinless life, taught amazing teachings, died on a cross, rose from the dead. I can promise you there is no historical person who comes close to Jesus Christ. None whatsoever. And there is absolutely no historical record that's credible of a resurrection other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the resurrection of Christ. It does not exist. When you study the resurrection of Osiris, it's not historical. It's not even claiming to be historical. Osiris is cut up into 14 pieces, which are scattered. Isis goes around, finds 13 of the 14 cut up pieces of Osiris, puts them back together, and Osiris comes back to life. But where is he living? In the underworld, man, not space-time. He's living in the underworld. So all you got to do is read Egyptian mythology for yourself, and you begin to realize the resurrection of Christ, which is a space-time historical event, is radically different from this resuscitation of Osiris in Egyptian mythology. It is not the same literature. Yes, ma'am.
Just because it's different, though, doesn't inherently mean that it's not a recycled story. We recycle Shakespeare, and the characters change, the settings change. How are you proving that just because we've seen this in other stories, like, what does Jesus being human have to do with anything?
Okay. The literature of the Gospels is qualitatively different from the literature of mythology.
So it's a different style, I agree
It's
with
making
that.
a totally different claim, ma'am. Totally different claim. It is claiming not, we thought this up, or this was revealed to us in a spiritual sense. Rather, it's claiming we saw this man Jesus, we heard him teach, we watched him die, and we saw him risen from the dead. It's a different claim, ma'am, a radically different claim.
Still a recycled story, though. Born of a virgin, died, resurrected 3 days later. You can see those things in other religions throughout history.
Which one?
The maize god.
Osiris.
No, Osiris has a type of spiritual resuscitation that is qualitatively different from a bodily resurrection.
Mayan hero
Explain the
twins had
difference
a
between the
virgin
Quran
birth.
and the four
not gonna address
Gospels. Because the Quran is technically historical evidence. Yes, it follows your points that you used. Yes or no?
The Quran is a very reliable document that tells us what Muhammad taught. Yes.
Okay, so if that's a historical evidence, so do you believe that Muhammad al-Rasul is the last messenger sent by God?
No, I don't.
But if you don't believe that, why not? If it follows your historical narrative.
Good. Sir, just because we have an historical record of a murderer does not make the murderer true.
You're using a hominem fallacy. Please don't do that.
Just because you have an historical record of evil does not mean I'm going to trust the evil. So, just because we have an historical record of Christ does not make Jesus the truth, guys. If any of you think you've misunderstood me, I'm not saying Jesus is the truth because he was an historical person. That is not my argument. My argument is, this is the claim of the text, that he was a real space-time person who made a claim to be God in human form. God come to the rescue to save us and give us eternal life. Now the question is there historical evidence that points to him being a liar, a wacko,
What up, man?
or is the evidence that he's reliable and trustworthy? And my point is, the historical evidence of his life, teachings, death, and resurrection points to him being reliable. Whereas the historical evidence from Muhammad is
That he was from Medina, he was a leader in Medina, and then he founded the Church of Islam, or
Right.
the Ummah, that's the proper terminology. He founded the Islamic faith.
okay. But as I read the Quran, there are so many contradictions philosophically. There are so many contradictions in terms of his lifestyle that I cannot trust Muhammad to reveal God
Give me
accurately.
evidence. I read the Quran.
All right. Repeatedly in the Quran, Jesus said, Muhammad writes, Jesus is not God. No problem, except the eyewitnesses who heard Christ, who watched Christ,
In the Bible.
insisted that Jesus is God.
In
That
the
was his
Bible,
claim.
not in the Quran, in the Bible. Let's just put that
In the
separate.
Gospels, that's right.
Let's make
In
sure.
the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record that Jesus claimed to be God. So now I have to make a decision. Is the Quran, written over 500 years after Christ, by a man who was born in 570, who obviously never met Christ, is that a more reliable source of information about what Jesus claimed than the eyewitnesses who saw Christ, who lived with Christ? Sir, that's a no-brainer. If I want to find out about an historical person, I don't go to some dude who lived 500 years after the fact.
But then
Instead,
again,
I go to the eyewitnesses.
The Gospels were written a couple hundred years after the fact that Jesus died. Yes or
No,
no?
sir. No.
Please tell me.
You bet. Clement, Bishop of Rome, in 95 AD. 95 AD.
95 years after.
No, 60 years after Christ, he's writing letters in which he quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the letters of Paul. So, you've got a letter, 95 AD, written by Clement, Bishop of Rome, in which he's quoting the Gospels, the writings of Paul. Obviously, they were in existence. They're being quoted in letters written in 95 AD. So the Gospels were not written hundreds of years after the fact. They were written right in the first century.
We have 4 Gospels out of hundreds of Gospels that did not make it into the Bible, that were considered not fitting together with the 4 that was chosen. How do we know any of this is a real person? How do we know it's not a legend? How do we know it wasn't based on a real Jewish rabbi with a little bit of embellishment? It's kind of like the same thing with King Arthur. Was there a King Arthur? Maybe there was, but it's been turned into legend so long ago that we can't really believe the legend, and it's hard to piece it apart as the actual person, King Arthur. Same thing with Jesus.
King Arthur lived approximately 5th century. All the writings about King Arthur come about 400 years later. The Gospels are all written in the 1st century, 20 to 60 years after Christ, which means you do not have the time for legend and mythology to grow up between Christ and the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. King Arthur, who lives in the 5th century, is not written about for 400 years. That's enough time for legend to spring up. To compare him to King Arthur, shows you've not thought clearer, because you're smarter than that. You don't make those kind of mistakes. You're a scientist. You're meticulous in your thinking. You're making a huge blunder, sir.
How about Paul Bunyan?
Yeah, what about Paul Bunyan?
How much is legend? How much is fact?
Well, what type of literature is Paul Bunyan spoken about in?
Usually stories, usually things that aren't meant to be real, portray reality.
Good. So let's nail it. What type of literature is it?
Legendary. Folklore.
No, it's not just legendary. It's modern, novelistic fiction.
Yeah.
Right? That literary style did not exist BC or for hundreds of years AD.
They never had stories in order to teach morals, in order to teach philosophical lessons.
So you got to listen closely. I said modern, novelistic, historical fiction. That is a literary style that we have today. That was not a literary style in the 1st or 2nd century BC or AD. The Gospels are written in historical narrative. That is their literary style. Eyewitness reportage. Modern, realistic fiction, historical fiction, was not a literary genre used in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century AD. Instead, you had things like epic poem, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Gospels are not epic poem. You had mythology, but it was not mythology and history wedded together the way we have in Superman, Batman, today. That literary style did not exist.
Maybe not by those words, But mythology existed for sure, and that's what I'm saying the Bible may be, is Christian.
Sure, we agree. Mythologies existed for thousands of years.
And they have their writings.
But not historical, novelistic, modern fiction. That did not exist.
So you say that the Gospels are eyewitness.
That's their claim.
That's their claim.
Correct.
We know that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are labels put on the Gospels.
No, they're not labels put on the Gospels.
If you look at the New Testament Bible, it will clearly say in the margin that these names have been historically assigned to them. We don't know if it was a Matthew or a Mark or a Luke that wrote them.
Why? Why are those names assigned to those writings? You think they just arbitrarily pulled this stuff out of the air? No, because we have the writings of Papias. We have the writings of Clement, Bishop of Rome, in 95 AD. We have the writings of Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, in 115 AD, in which they talk about the Gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. These aren't just pulled out of the air. Now you're right. You're right in making a point that the original autographs, the original manuscripts did not have at the beginning the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke. That was not there. Instead, you just had the Gospel. But it was known broadly by the eyewitnesses and by those who listened to the eyewitnesses that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. And so later on, after the eyewitnesses begin to die off, they do attach the Gospel of Matthew at the top of the manuscript, okay? But you're right, we can't prove it that Matthew wrote Matthew, but the evidence is Matthew wrote Matthew.
So Matthew was hearsay based on verbal accounts, and then they wrote it down on the one
No,
that
not hearsay. Eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses testify this was written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let me say it one more time. Eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses insisted that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. Both eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses. All right?
These eyewitnesses are in the exact same book that, we're not trusting anyways yet because we have no reason to trust it. So,
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's very circular and it's contained completely in the Bible.
Circular?
Yes.
Oh, that's dishonest intellectually as all get out. Because you have not asked me the honest question, which is, why do you trust those documents to give you accurate information? Instead, you've just jumped to a conclusion that I'm being circular. So come on, sir, why don't you ask me? Cliff, what's the evidence that the Gospels are historically reliable?
I've already told you they're not historically reliable, and you've already agreed that they're embellishments in certain areas.
I have not agreed that they're embellishments, ever. Never once did I.
Look like flesh.
Sir, that's not in the Gospels. The Gospels do not include a flood account. That's in Genesis. We're talking about Jesus. You don't read about Jesus in Genesis.
In the Gospels where the devil supposedly takes Jesus up onto the highest mountain and sees all the world, all the four corners.
Yes.
You think that literally happened?
No.
See around the conflict, so that's embellishment.
No. That is symbolism.
And where was the eyewitness that wrote that?
It's not embellishment, it's symbolism.
And where was the eyewitness that was there?
Jesus communicated to people that he had this experience. No, sir. If I have an experience and I tell her, ma'am, I had this experience, I am reporting to her my experience. Now, I'm either lying to her or I'm telling the truth, but I am insisting this happened to me. I was born in New York City at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. Now, she can't prove that. She can go out and try to find birth records, but I am communicating I was born at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. That's not hearsay. That is me communicating to her the truth about my life. Is faith alone enough to get into heaven? Genuine faith? Yes. Hypocritical faith? No. What does that mean? If I say, I trust you, and then when I leave you like this. I don't trust you, because I think you might stick me in the back. So that's why I walk away like this. If I say I trust you, it means I have no problem with doing this and walking away. Because when I turn my back, maybe you could stick me, but I trust you not to. If I say I trust you, then I'm willing to do this with my wallet. Put it in your hand. Exactly. But how do I know you're not going to run away? Because the evidence is you are trustworthy. Okay? John writes in 1 John, if I say I love God, but I hate my brother, I'm a liar. Oh, how easy it is to say, I love God who I cannot see, and hate my brother who I can see. That is why I'm so grateful in the United States still today, even though we're deeply committed as a culture to relativism, we still have the word hypocrite. The word hypocrite is a great word. What's it talking about? It's vice's complement to virtue. It's people saying, you know something? You say you're a Christian, look how you live. You contradict by your lifestyle what you say you believe in. That's hypocrisy. Bravo. I'm still glad that in this culture committed to relativism, we don't really live it out. Instead we say, if you say you're a Christian and you have a racist attitude, you're a stinking hypocrite. If you say you're a Christian and you go out and sleep around, you're a stinking hypocrite. Cut it out. Apocrypha being taken out of the Bible.
Yes.
Sir, the Apocrypha was not in the Bible until the 1500s, when in response to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent in the early 1500s added the Apocrypha, the intertestamental series of books, including 1st and 2nd Maccabees and Judith, to the Bible. And today, the Catholic Church accepts the Apocrypha, and the Protestant Church does not. So, the Apocrypha was never pulled out of the original. The original did not include the Apocrypha. Why? Because the Apocrypha wasn't introduced into the Bible until the Council of Trent in the early 1500s. So, sir, why are you so tricky in giving me false information out here?
So it's changed twice, is what you're saying.
No.
And if we go back further, we can go back to the Marconian or Marcionian Bible, which didn't have any of the Old Testament and only had one gospel. We can also go to the Constantinople Bible, which had different passages in it as well. I see a document that's changing with the times.
Well, of course. You have people today saying the Bible says that the Republican Party is God's party. That doesn't mean the Bible says that. And yes, Marcion had a real problem with anti-Semitic feelings, and therefore Marcion, who you're referring to, cut out all of writings by Jews. Therefore, he only accepted the Gospel of Luke, because Luke was a Gentile.
It wasn't Gospel of Luke, it was similar to the Gospel of Luke.
No, it was the Gospel of Luke that he accepted because it was written by a Gentile. So yes, sir, you also had the Gnostic Gospels in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century AD, and the reason that the Universal Church rejected the Gnostic Gospels is because they were based on Gnostic philosophy. But I can promise you, sir, the 27 New Testament books haven't been tampered with. They were put together over a period of time. The Shepherd of Hermas was seriously considered to be, maybe we should include it.
You know how the Gospel of Mark has changed over time?
Yeah, I know that the Gospel of Mark has not changed over time other than what's already in the footnotes. Like at the end of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 16, it's clearly noted. This end of Mark 16 is not in the earliest Greek manuscripts.
Right.
Instead, it was added at a later date. That is right there in the footnotes, in the NIV, in the Revised Standard Version. So there's no hanky-panky, there's no cover-up. Guess what? You take the end of Mark 16 out of the New Testament, you have nothing changed. You still have Christ crucified and Christ risen from the dead.
You have an empty grave is all you have, because it ends at the empty grave and the women running off and telling no one, and then that's where Mark ended.
Fine.
But that didn't jive with the other three.
It jives totally. You cannot make an argument from silence. Mark is silent. And if Mark is silent, you better not be so intellectually dishonest that you would add. If I say something and you say, Cliff says, you quote me, and then you add to what I say, that's dishonest.
The addition was dishonest to Mark.
No,
Where'd it come from?
you don't know that.
You don't know it wasn't.
That's right. That's why there's the footnote. Watch out, because we don't know exactly how reliable the end of Mark 16 is. The same is true with John chapter 8. The woman caught in the act of adultery. Once again, in the manuscripts, you will read John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, was not in the earliest Greek manuscripts. Nothing hidden. The question is, why was it introduced? Was it a true story of Christ interacting with this woman caught in the act of adultery, or was it not? We don't know.
It was also,
and that's why you wouldn't want to base your life on John 8.
And also in earlier writings, that same passage would be attributed to different testaments or different gospels.
No. John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11 was not attributed to Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It was clearly attributed to John, and it was clearly added at a later date. So that is why, right in the footnotes, there's a note, John chapter 8 is not in the earliest Greek manuscripts. Sir, the manuscript evidence for the New Testament is superior to any document from antiquity. Any document. All right, give me one example of a good alternative.
Sir, the Bible is a plagiarism of much more ancient texts.
Like which
and
ones?
writings.
Which ones?
We can go back so many years. Give me a break. The Vedas, for one. That was
How are the Gospels based on the Vedas?
on universal truth. Universal truth is the universal truth. It cannot be changed.
What is the universal truth in the Vedas that the Gospels record?
To yourself, to be good to others, to do good work.
Where does Jesus say be true to yourself?
Doesn't it say love thy neighbor as thyself?
God is
It says love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say be true to yourself.
No, it says to love yourself. We have to begin by loving ourselves so we can love other people.
All right, so there are ethical similarities, but to try and argue that the Gospels are simply stealing or borrowing from the Vedas and Upanishads, that's not
It
true.
is a completely disjointed book that was put together by human beings who didn't like some of the other versions that should have, would have been included in what we have today.
Like
It is
which one?
Completely disjointed.
Which ones are you referring
The
to?
items found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are all not items that should have been. Those are items that should have been included in the Bible. The Bible needs
They
to
were.
be revised.
In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have Isaiah. Isaiah was in the Bible. So what's your point?
There were many other books that have been found that have not been included in the Bible that would have
Yeah, the
caused
Gnostic
the Bible
Gospels?
to make more sense instead of being so disjointed. Makes absolutely no sense. You have the story of Cain and Abel, which is a far more ancient story than the Bible. I don't
It's in the Bible. It's not more ancient than the Bible. It's in the Bible.
Mary Magdalene was the first
Not
one.
those names are ancient. Those names are not ancient, but certainly by another name they are more ancient. These are
Okay,
not-
where do you read about Cain and Abel? What other book other than Genesis do you read about Cain and Abel? All right, yes, sir. What's your question?
Well, the Nicene Creed, like later on after when people realized they were really confused about is Jesus God or is he the Son of God?
Right.
And so later on in time,
Yes.
they had to create the Nicene Creed to make people know he's not the Son of God, he's actually God. So like explain that to me, if you like the whole thing. It was really
Great question. Serious question, thoughtfully put forward. Thank you, sir. You're right. There was confusion and debate among people who call themselves Christians in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, in the 21st century. You will get religion professors, I debate them on college campuses, who think Jesus is not God. Great teacher, but not God. So, why have I concluded, why has the Orthodox Christian Church concluded that Jesus is really God in human form? Because in the eyewitness Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, either written by an eyewitness or by someone who knew an eyewitness, like Luke. Luke was not an eyewitness, but Luke knew the apostles. But in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the humanity of Christ is clearly taught. He was born of a woman, Mary. He had human emotions, joy, sorrow. He was tempted. He experienced pain. He experienced death. He experienced betrayal. Judas Iscariot betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. He was human. But then, this human man, Jesus of Nazareth, has the audacity to claim to be the one true God. He repeated the Shema of Israel. In Mark chapter 12, verses 29 to 31, Jesus says, the most important commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus stuck to Jewish monotheism, one God. But then he claimed to be God, God the Son. And that's why he was nailed to a cross, for blasphemy. Because he had the audacity, as a Jewish man who held to the Old Testament Torah, he claimed to be God. That's why he was nailed. That's blasphemy. Punishable by death. So, followers of Christ have struggled to think through and communicate, what does it mean, the incarnation, that God became a human being? Very difficult concept. He was truly a human being, but he was more than a human being. He was God in human form. That's hard, very hard.
Haven't many other people made the same claim? Again, let's go back to ancient Egypt. All Pharaoh believed himself, and so did the people believe that they were demigods.
Ready? Sure. All right, so, who claims to be God? You say Pharaoh. Fine. What is the evidence?
I said they claim to be.
They claim to be God. So all you have to do is study the pharaohs, and you will have more than enough evidence that they were very fickle, finite human beings, the same way you and I are. But when you read about Jesus, the way he lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead historically, not mythologically, not in legend, but when you study the way Christ historically rose from the dead, suddenly you're in touch with someone who is qualitatively different from a king who says, I'm God, a pharaoh who says, I'm God. Suddenly you're confronted by a man who lives this amazing life, teaches incredible ethical teachings, dies on a cross, and rises from the dead. No, ma'am, there is no other historical resurrection other than Christ of anybody who claims to be God. Who else rose from the dead? Muhammad? No, Muhammad did not rise from the dead. There is a belief that Muhammad ascended to heaven after his death. That is not an historical resurrection. In space and time, the Gospels are claiming the dead Christ was buried 3 days. At the end of 3 days, he rose from the dead. That is the claim. When I put my faith in Christ, what that means is, I trust you, Jesus. I trust you as God. I trust you as the one who gave me life. I trust you as the one who defines justice and injustice, right and wrong. Which means, even though my culture might teach me to be racist, I'm going to violate my culture, I'm going to follow Christ and not be racist. Classic example, 2 white women, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, grew up on a plantation in South Carolina. Obviously, the culture of South Carolina taught them slavery is very good because it's what makes the economic wheels go round and round. But Sarah and Angelina Grimke followed their conscience, Jesus Christ, their faith in him. They left that plantation, they went north and joined the abolitionist movement. That is an example of free will, used in a responsible way, where you understand morality is not relative, my culture doesn't define right and wrong, there's a law above the law of the great state of Alabama, as Dr. Martin Luther King pointed out so accurately, which means I am, as a thinking human being, going to respond to my conscience, not my culture. Does that make sense?
Yes, I completely understand what you're trying to say. But here's the unfortunate fact of history. Whereas people went in South Carolina or
Right.
South Carolina, their culture was in the Bible. Their Bible,
Yes.
it was a part of their culture.
Yes.
And those two ladies you spoke about, they used their free will and their understanding of the Bible to move away. But here's the thing, that's interpretation. There was a group of people that believed that the Bible was telling them slavery was okay, but then those ladies interpreted it in a different way to leave. So
Yep.
is that, and that's one of the fallacies I find in the Bible. You can interpret it so differently. That's why there's so many denominations.
Good. Excellent. You're absolutely right. But sir, just because I can misinterpret you, does that mean there's not an accurate interpretation of what you've said? For instance, if I go over to my wife and point to you and say, you know, this guy was very disrespectful of me, that's a wrong interpretation. Because in reality, sir, you've been incredibly respectful of me. Now, if I misinterpret you and go over to my wife and say, oh, this guy, man, he just dumped on me, I am wrong. That's an inaccurate interpretation. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
But you use that interpretation to tell your wife, and
Yes.
your wife is going to tell other people. It's going to, it's like that interpretation
Yes,
is going to
sir.
spread.
That's
And
right,
That's
yes.
how that was the basis.
You bet. Okay. But you see, wait a second. But Well, wait a second. There is a right answer. You have been respectful of me. It is a lie for me to say that you've been disrespectful of me. It is the truth to say you've been incredibly respectful of me, and I thank you for it. Now, there's been some other turkeys who've gone through here the past 4 days who've been quite disrespectful of me, all right? But not you. So you see, you've got to learn to interpret right. You are responsible to interpret correctly.
Using that example, wouldn't that be hard to like say that person that thought he was disrespectful, even though he was, what would make that person not able to tell many more people rather than the right person who thought he was like that other person could have been the one that spread it. You don't know.
Yep.
That's right. That was my point. That's the whole idea of the different denominations in Christianity. So there has to be one, according to your logic, there has to be one right. But which one is the right one?
No. Wait a second. There doesn't have to be just one right, but if two things contradict each other, they're either both wrong or one of them's right. You can't have two contradictory ideas both being right. Okay? So, the KKK, Dr. Martin Luther King. They cannot both be right.
I agree.
All right? So then the question is Dr. Martin Luther King right? Is the KKK wrong when it comes to the issue of African Americans? Now, the fact that the KKK tries to use the Bible, the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King obviously used the Bible, helps us. Because now we can go to the Bible to find out who's being consistent with what the Bible teaches. And you don't have to have a PhD in New Testament to read the Gospels about Jesus and figure out, man, the KKK twisted the living daylights, misinterpreted totally the Gospels. And Dr. Martin Luther King, with his peaceful resistance against racism, wow, he hit it out of the ballpark. That's why we respect him as highly as we do.
Using the same example, since there are technically you telling everyone's interpretation of what he was saying or how he is would be different denominations in theory. Like if we're using this example, that would be different denominations. How do you know which denomination was right if one, that you have to understand that the person that's right has to be able to influence everyone else that this is right.
Right.
But how do you know that the people that interpreted them wrong had way more influence than that person and is able to,
you bet.
I guess, spread?
Okay, now based on what I've said, you guys know the answer, right? It's a great question you asked, yes sir. But based on what I've said, how do you determine whether a church, whatever the church is,
Historical evidence, right?
exactly, the Gospels. If a church says, we're following Jesus, and you go into that church with those people, and they begin to contradict Christ, you don't have to have a PhD in the New Testament to figure out, time out, if Jesus says the opposite of what you're saying, you have parted company with Christ.
Wouldn't that be equivalent of the, say that person that was wrong and is able to spread this influence, that person has a book that has historical fact of people that were at that time in that space, but he uses his interpretation that he was an evil person even though he's not.
Right.
But he uses this book now to teach everyone else this, and this is the right thing.
Sure.
And now you're using that, say you're a person that follows the wrong person, but you're using his book to back up your evidence.
Okay.
Go the KKK.
Right. It's very similar to science. Okay? Science is a beautiful study, branch of knowledge. I have a younger brother who transplants kidneys and livers. He's trying to help the body not reject the new kidney with scientific research. Okay? How did Adolf Hitler use eugenics? To create the super race of white Aryans. Is that sick or is that sick?
Fun fact, it actually started in California in the 1920s, and then Adolf Hitler got that idea from America to do eugenics.
Okay, so be it California, be it Nazi Germany, all right?
That's a fun fact.
All right. Another historical fact. After World War I, H.G. Wells wrote a book in which he says, knowledge, science have defeated evil. It's over. World War I was the war to end all wars. Then World War II came along, and H.G. Wells had the honesty to write, My faith in science is bankrupt. I have watched the most highly scientific, technologically educated nation of the world, Nazi Germany, commit the most horrible atrocities imaginable. Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald. Now, does Nazi Germany discredit science? No. Nazi Germany's use of science in eugenics and in gassing Jews is an example of free will using something good, science, to rip life apart. I don't reject science because Nazis used eugenics to wipe out Jews. Similarly, just because people pervert the Bible and use the Bible to justify rape, polygamy, racism, slavery, does not mean I reject the Bible. It means I reject their misinterpretation and their false use of the Bible.